There was a wing of Sherbourne Court that no one was permitted to enter, and Nell Carey, who had been 6 weeks a laundry-maid in that great mournful house and had learned its rules as a careful servant learns them, had never once been tempted to break this one. Until the gray afternoon in November, when she carried a basket of mended linen down a corridor she did not know, and found a door standing open that was always kept shut, and felt, against all sense and all her careful training, her feet carry her toward it as though she were called. She could not afterwards say what drew her. The house was full of shut doors and sad silences. Sherbourne Court was a house of grief, everyone said so. A great cold, half-shut place where a broken old duke lived alone among his sorrows and never came down, and where the servants spoke low and the dust lay thick in the rooms no one used. And Nell, being a sensible girl who knew her place and meant to keep her position, had minded her own work and asked no questions and gone where she was sent and nowhere else. But there was something about that open door, something about the whole of this house, if she were honest, that had unsettled her from the first hour she set foot in it. A strange and growing sense, which she could not explain and had told no one, that she had been here before, that she knew the turn of these stairs, the fall of this light, the very smell of these old rooms, though she had never in her life been within 50 miles of the place until 6 weeks ago. It made no sense. She was a foundling, raised a laundress by humble folk in a town far off. She had no more business feeling at home in a duke's house than the scullery cat. And yet she did, and the feeling drew her that gray afternoon through the door that was always shut into a long, shadowed gallery she had never seen. It was a portrait gallery. The faces of the dead dukes and duchesses of Sherbourne ranged along the walls in their gilded frames, generations of them, proud and cold and long gone. And Nell went down it slowly, her basket forgotten on her arm, drawn by that strange pull deeper and deeper into the shadows, past the painted lords and ladies who watched her with their painted eyes, until she came to the end of the gallery, where one portrait hung apart from the rest, larger than the others, in a place of honor, with a faded ribbon of black crepe draped across its frame as though it were mourned. And Nell raised her eyes to it, and the world stopped, for the portrait was of a young duchess, a beautiful young woman in the dress of a generation past, seated in a garden with a sprig of forget-me-nots in her hand. And the face that looked down out of the gilded frame, calm and lovely and a little sad, the face of a great lady dead these 20 years and more, was Nell Carey's own face, not a likeness, not a resemblance. Her own face, the same eyes, the same brow, the same curve of the cheek and set of the mouth, the very face Nell saw each morning in the cracked glass of her attic room, looking down at her now from the wall of a duke's gallery, painted long before she was born. Nell stood rooted, her heart slamming, unable to breathe or move or make any sense of the impossible thing before her, staring up at her own face in a dead duchess's portrait. And so she did not hear the slow footsteps behind her until a voice spoke, a cracked, old voice, thin with disuse and shaking with something terrible, and said, "Lavinia?" She turned. An old man stood in the gallery doorway, old and bent and worn to a shadow, with a face ravaged by some long, unhealed grief, and eyes that were fixed upon Nell with an expression of such anguished, disbelieving, desperate hope that it stopped the breath in her throat. The broken Duke of Sherbourne, who never came down, who lived alone among his sorrows. And he was staring at her living face, as a man stares at a ghost. One trembling hand had risen toward her. His lips shaped a name that was not hers, and yet, somehow, in the deepest, unreachable place in her, almost was. And Nell Carey, looked at the portrait, and looked at the broken old man gazing at her as though she were the dead come back to life, and felt some vast locked door swing open in the dark of her, some knowledge older than memory rising up from before all her rememberings. And she heard her own voice, faint and wondering, and not quite her own, breathe a single word into the silence of that mournful gallery. "Father?" To understand how a laundry-maid came to stand beneath a duchess's portrait wearing the duchess's own face, you must go back to the beginning of Nell Carey. Though the beginning of Nell Carey was, as it turned out, a thing that even Nell herself had never truly known. She had been raised in the town of Marbury, a good many miles from Sherbourne, by a laundress named Martha Carey and her husband Tom, a carter, and they had been the only family she had ever known, and a kinder one no foundling could have asked for. For Nell was a foundling. That much she had always been told, plainly and without shame. For the Careys were honest people who did not hold with lies. She had been left with them as an infant, a babe of a few months, by a traveling woman who had come to their door one winter night, paid a sum of money for the child's keep, said only that the babe was an orphan with no one in the world, and gone away into the dark, and never been seen again. And the Careys, who were childless and warm-hearted, had taken the infant in and called her Nell, and raised her as their own, with all the love they had. And Nell had grown up a laundress's daughter, working at the great copper tubs from the time she was tall enough to reach them, and had never wanted for love, whatever else she had wanted for, which was a great deal, the Careys being very poor. And Nell had been, from a child, a puzzle to everyone who knew her, for she was not at all what a foundling raised among the washtubs of Marbury had any business being. She was clever, with a quick, deep mind that took to reading the moment the curate's wife taught her her letters, and that hungered after more than a poor town could give it. She was dignified, with a natural grace and bearing that the other girls mocked as putting on airs, and that the gentlefolk whose linen she washed remarked upon with puzzled approval. She was good, truly good, kind, and honest and steady, with a quiet strength in her that hard poverty had only tempered, never broken. There was something about Nell Carey, everyone agreed, that did not match her station. Something fine in the grain of her that no amount of washtub and want could coarsen. And the wiser heads of Marbury had sometimes wondered, watching her, what manner of people had bred such a child and abandoned her to a carter's cottage, and whether there were not some story behind the silver locket she wore. For there was a locket. It was the one thing Nell had brought with her into the world, the one clue to wherever she had come from. A small, fine locket of good silver, worked with a wreath of forget-me-nots and a single engraved letter, an L, that had been pinned to the infant's blanket the night she was left, and that Martha Carey had kept safe all these years and given to Nell when she was grown, saying only that it had come with her and was surely from her true people, and might one day tell her who they were. Nell had worn it always, beneath her plain dress, against her heart, had wondered over it 1,000 times, had built, as lonely clever children do, whole secret histories around it, none of them anywhere near the truth. And when, 6 weeks before that gray November afternoon, the chance had come to better herself by taking a place as a laundry-maid in a great house, Sherbourne Court, far off, where they paid good wages and a clever willing girl might rise, Nell had kissed her foster parents goodbye and taken her few things and her silver locket and gone, never dreaming that she was going home. It is worth telling something of Nell's life in Marbury before ever she came to Sherbourne, for it was that life, and not her noble blood, that made her what she was, and the people who shaped her deserved their place in her story far more than the fortune that found her at the end. The Careys were poor poor in the grinding, anxious, never quite enough way of the honest, laboring poor, who work from dark to dark and lie awake over the rent. But they were rich in the one thing that matters most to a child, which is love steadily given. And Nell had grown up in a cottage where there was often little bread, but never any shortage of kindness. Martha Carey was a laundress, a big, strong, cheerful woman with red hands and a warm heart, who had wept the day the traveling woman left the infant and had loved the child fiercely from that hour, and who had taught Nell, over the years of bending together at the steaming tubs, not merely the trade, but the whole of her own homely wisdom. That honest work was no shame, that a clean conscience slept better than a full belly, that you treated the high and the low alike, for God had made both and would judge you by neither, that self-respect cost nothing and was worth everything, and no one could take it from you who did not first persuade you to give it away. And Tom Carey, the carter, a slow, gentle giant of a man, had given the child what a father gives, a sense of safety, of being someone's, of having in the world one large, warm, certain presence that would always stand between her and harm. And he had carried her on his shoulders to see the fairs, and told her tales on winter nights, and been, in every way that the word truly means, her father, long before another father was so much as dreamed of. It was from these two, the washerwoman and the carter, that Nell had got everything the great house would later marvel at and could not account for. Her dignity was Martha's, the unbreakable self-respect of a poor woman who had never let poverty make her small. Her steadiness and gentleness were Tom's. Her honesty, her kindness, her refusal to grasp or fawn or pretend, the straight, clear way she had of looking a duke in the eye and answering him as one soul to another. All of it had been bred in her not by noble blood, of which she knew nothing, but by the daily example of two poor people who had been, in the ways that count, as noble as any duke in England. And this was the thing that the proud world, when it learned her story, could never quite take in, and that Nell herself understood perfectly, that her nobility was not in her blood at all, or not chiefly, that a duke's daughter raised by Bertram Vance might have grown up a monster, and a carter's foundling raised by the Careys had grown up a lady, that the blood gave the face, but the cottage gave the soul. She never forgot it, and never let anyone else forget it either. And when, in her grand later life, some fine person marveled that she carried her rank so naturally, having been raised so low, she would say that she had been raised, on the contrary, very high indeed, higher than most of the nobility. For she had been raised by people who loved her and taught her her worth, which is the highest raising there is, and a thing that all the coronets in the kingdom cannot buy. The strange sense of homecoming that had unsettled Nell from her first hour at Sherbourne deserves a fuller telling, for it was no mere fancy of the narrators, but a real and growing thing that troubled the practical girl considerably, and that she could explain to no one, least of all herself. It had begun the very day she arrived, a creeping, uncanny familiarity, wholly without sense, that grew stronger the longer she stayed. She had known, somehow, the way the great staircase turned before she climbed it. She had felt, passing certain doors, an unaccountable pull, a sense of something just beyond them that she ought to remember. She had dreamed, those 6 weeks, dreams she could not hold on waking, but that left her with a sweet, aching sense of loss. Dreams of a soft voice singing, of a garden with blue flowers, of being held and rocked in a sunlit room she had never seen. She had stood once at a particular window, looking out over the park, and been seized by a grief so sudden and so vast and so entirely without cause that she had had to set down her work and weep, and could not have said for what. And she had said nothing of any of it, for what was there to say? A laundry-maid does not tell her betters that their house gives her uncanny dreams. She would have been thought mad, or fanciful, or worse, dismissed. So she had kept it to herself, and put it down to the strangeness of a great sad house, and gone on with her work, unsettled, not knowing that what stirred in her was the deepest and most buried thing a human creature carries, the memory of the body, of the first few months of life, that the mind cannot reach, but that lives on somewhere below all reaching, the memory of having been, once, in this house, an infant rocked in a sunlit room by a soft-voiced mother, before the dark came and carried her away. For that, the wiser heads said afterward, was surely the truth of it, that Nell had been some months old when she was stolen, old enough that her infant senses had drunk in, below all later memory, the turn of the stairs and the fall of the light, and the smell of the old rooms, and her mother's face, and her mother's song, and that those drowned impressions, sealed away for 23 years beneath a whole life lived elsewhere, had stirred in their depths when she came again, after all that time, into the place that had printed them. She did not remember Sherbourne. One cannot remember the cradle. But her body remembered, in the only way the body can, by a wordless pull and an unaccountable grief and a sense of homecoming that her mind could make no sense of. And it was that buried bodily knowing, surely, that had drawn her feet down the strange corridor and through the door that was always shut and into the gallery where her own face waited on the wall. Drawn her, you might almost say, home, by a road her conscious self had forgotten she had ever traveled. It is a strange thing to think of, that somewhere below all our knowing, the body keeps faith with the places and the faces of its beginning, though the mind lets them go entirely. That a stolen child, grown to a woman, might be drawn across half a county by the drowned memory of a mother's song. But Nell believed it ever after, for she had felt it, and she thought it the tenderest proof she ever had of how completely she had once been loved. That even her infant body, too young for any memory, had kept the print of that love for 23 years, and known the way back to it, and brought her home. The grief that lay over Sherbourne Court like a shroud had a date and a name, and Nell had heard the story in pieces in her 6 weeks there, in the low talk of the older servants, never dreaming it was her own. 23 years before, the Duke of Sherbourne, Geoffrey, the present broken old man, then in the prime of his life, had married for love, which dukes seldom do, a beautiful and gentle girl named Lavinia. And the two of them had been as happy, by every account, as ever a couple was, devoted past the ordinary, the great mournful house in those days, a place of light and music and laughter. They had wanted only one thing, and waited long for it, a child. And at last, after some years, the child had come, a daughter, born one spring amid such rejoicing as the county had not seen in a generation. The longed-for heiress of Sherbourne, christened with all the pomp of her great house, the very sun and center of her parents' adoring world. And then, when the child was but a few months old, she had vanished. No one quite knew, even now, how it had happened, for the family had drawn a veil of silence over the whole unbearable business that the years had never lifted. There had been some journey, the Duchess and the infant traveling to a second house, or from it, and some confusion, some catastrophe never fully explained, and at the end of it, the child was simply gone, lost, vanished from the face of the earth and never found, though the Duke had moved heaven and earth and spent a fortune in the searching. Whether she had been stolen, or lost, or worse, no one could say with certainty. The prevailing belief, in the end, the belief the family had been brought to accept was that the infant had died in the confusion and been lost, and a small, empty grave had been made for her in the Sherbourne chapel, and the searching had stopped. But the Duchess Lavinia had never accepted it, never believed her child dead, never ceased to grieve and to hope and to waste away. And within the year she too was gone, dead of a broken heart. The doctors said, having simply lost the will to live without her stolen daughter. And the Duke of Sherbourne, who had lost in 1 year his child and his wife and every joy he had shut up the bright rooms and drawn the shroud over the house and withdrawn into a grief from which, in 23 years, he had never once emerged. He never came down. He never saw company. He lived among the portraits of his dead, and most of all, before the great portrait of his Lavinia in the locked gallery, where he went each day to mourn the wife and the child the world had taken from him. And he had let the management of his vast estate and fortune fall, year by year, into the hands of the one relation who had stayed close through it all. His cousin, Mr. Bertram Vance, a smooth and capable and attentive man, who had made himself indispensable to the broken Duke, and who, in the long absence of any nearer heir, stood to inherit the whole great Sherbourne fortune, when at last the old man died. It was a sad story, the servants agreed, the saddest in the county. And Nell, washing linen in the great house where it had happened, had pitied the poor old Duke and his lost child and his dead Duchess with all her tender heart, and had never once, in 6 weeks, dreamed that the lost child was herself. If you are listening by your own fire tonight, the lamp low, the dark drawn close, the day's labors set gently down, then settle in and let me tell you the story of the laundress who found her own face upon a duchess's wall, and the broken father who got back, at the last, the child the world had stolen. For this is a story about the things that blood remembers though the mind forgets, about a worth that no station can give and no poverty can take away, and about how the truth, however long and however cruelly it is buried, has a way of rising at last to the surface, like a face out of the dark of an old portrait. I shall tell you, before the end, where in the world I picture you sitting, but first you must know what happened in that gallery after the laundress breathed the word "Father," and how a great house and a wicked man received the rising of a truth they had thought safely buried for 23 years. It was the old housekeeper, Mrs. Halloway, who first put the matter beyond all doubt, and she did it within the hour, weeping with the silver locket in her trembling hand. For the old Duke in the gallery had not been able to speak. He had only stood and trembled and gazed at Nell's living face beneath his dead wife's portrait, the tears running unheeded down his ravaged cheeks, his lips shaping his Lavinia's name, his whole shattered being caught between an impossible hope and the terror of believing it. And it was the commotion, the strange sounds from the forbidden gallery, that had brought Mrs. Halloway hurrying. Mrs. Halloway, who had been housekeeper at Sherbourne for 40 years, who had served the young Duchess Lavinia and loved her, who had held the lost child at her christening and wept at her tiny, empty grave. And Mrs. Halloway had come into the gallery and seen the laundry-maid standing white and trembling beneath the portrait, and stopped dead as though struck, and her old hand had flown to her mouth, and she had whispered, "Dear God in heaven, dear God, it is her face. It is the Duchess's own face come again." And then, crossing herself, hardly daring, she had come close and looked into Nell's eyes and said in a shaking voice, Child, where did you come from? Who were your people? Have you any token, Anything that came with you?" And Nell, beyond all power of refusal, had drawn out from beneath her plain dress the silver locket on its worn ribbon, the locket she had worn against her heart her whole life, and Mrs. Halloway had taken it in her trembling fingers, and turned it to the gray light, and seen the wreath of forget-me-nots and the engraved letter L. And the old woman's knees had given way beneath her, so that she sank down upon the gallery floor with the locket pressed to her lips, weeping and laughing at once, crying out, "It is hers! It is the christening locket!" I was there. I saw the Duchess fasten it about the baby's neck with her own hands. Forget-me-nots, she chose, forget-me-nots, that she should never be forgotten. Oh, my lady, my lost lady, my baby that we buried in an empty grave. You have come home. You have come home. You were never dead at all. You have come home to us after all these years, and the broken old Duke had made a sound that was hardly human. A great cry of 23 years' damned grief breaking all at once, and he had crossed the gallery and taken his daughter's face in his two old shaking hands, and looked into the eyes that were his Lavinia's eyes, and known her. And Nell Carey, the laundry-maid, the foundling, the nobody, had been gathered into the arms of the Duke of Sherbourne, her father, and known, at 23 years of age, for the first time in her life, what it was to belong. The first days after the gallery were, for Nell and her father both, a strange and tender and almost unbearable time. The time of a father and daughter learning each other across the gulf of 23 lost years, with no shared past to stand on, but the blood between them and the love that leapt up to bridge the rest. The old Duke could hardly bear to let her out of his sight. Having lost her once, into a dark that had swallowed 23 years, he seemed to fear that she might vanish again the moment he looked away, and he would sit with her for hours, simply looking at her, tracing in her living face the features of the wife he had mourned, asking her endless questions about the life he had not been there to see, her childhood, the Careys, the washtubs, every small particular of the years he had lost, and weeping, often, not from grief now, but from the unbearable mixture of joy at having her and sorrow at all he had missed, the first steps and the first words, and the whole growing up of his only child gone forever, lived out in a carter's cottage while he sat in the dark, believing her dead. "I should have known," he said to her once, brokenly. "A father should have known his child was living. I let them tell me you were dead. I made you a grave. I gave up. Your mother never gave up. She knew, to her last breath she knew you lived, and I thought her grief had turned her mind, and I gave up. And you were alive all the while, scrubbing linen, motherless, fatherless, and I never came." And Nell had taken his old hands and told him what she came truly to believe, that he must not torment himself with the years that were gone, for they could not be helped now, and that they had something better to do with whatever years were left, which was to be glad. "You did not fail me, father," she said. "You were lied to by a wicked man most cruelly, and you grieved me as truly dead, which is no fault. And I was not motherless and fatherless. I was loved all my life by good people who stood in your place, and I have come to no harm, and here I am, whole and well and yours, with my whole life before me and you in it. Let us not weep for the years we lost. Let us be glad of the years we have. It is what my mother would wish, I think. She who never gave up. She would not have us spend our found happiness mourning. She would have us live." And the old Duke, hearing his dead Lavinia's own spirit speak out of his living daughter's mouth, had begun, by such slow degrees, to come back to life. The change in him was the wonder of the household. even under Vance's gathering shadow. The broken recluse who had not come down in years now came down daily. The man who had let the world go dark now wanted the curtains drawn back. The rooms opened, the dust swept out. He began to eat and to walk in the park leaning on his daughter's arm, and even, once or twice, before the trouble came, to laugh. A rusty, disused sound that made the old servants weep to hear it. For 23 years he had been dying by inches of a grief he would not survive. And now, in a single afternoon, the dead had been given back to him, and he was returning to the land of the living as a man returns from a long illness, weak and wondering and unspeakably grateful for the simplest things. The sun, the green of the park, the sound of his daughter's voice saying, "Father." It was this, the visible resurrection of the broken old man, that made Vance's poison so peculiarly cruel. For to make the Duke doubt his daughter was not merely to wrong Nell, but to threaten to plunge the old man back into the dark from which she had just drawn him, and to kill, a second time, and for good, the hope that was bringing him back to life. Vance knew it. He counted on it. He knew that a man so newly and so fragilely returned from such a grief could be most easily ruled through his very terror of losing his happiness again. And he played upon that terror without mercy, for it was the surest lever he had. Of the Duchess Lavinia herself, the woman in the portrait, the mother Nell had never known. Something should be told, for she was the heart of the whole tragedy, and her love reached out of the grave, in the end, to save the daughter she had lost. She had been, by every account that survived her, a rare and lovely soul. Not merely beautiful, though she had been that, but good and gentle and warm, with a sweetness that had won the heart of a proud duke, who had meant to marry for advantage and married for love instead, and the hearts of all her household besides, from the highest to the lowest. The old servants who remembered her spoke of her always with a particular tenderness, as of someone too good for the world that had used her so cruelly. Mrs. Halloway could not speak of her without weeping, even after 23 years. She had loved her husband and been loved by him, with a completeness that was the wonder of a loveless aristocratic age. And when at last, after long waiting, the child had come, she had poured into that infant daughter a love so fierce and so entire that those who saw it had almost feared for her, saying that no mother should love so wholly, for the world is uncertain, and the heart that loves without reserve is the heart most surely broken. And so it had proved. When the child was taken, something in the Duchess Lavinia had refused, from the first hour, to believe her dead. A mother's deep instinct, the same wordless knowing that lived in the infant's stolen body, told her that her daughter lived, and she had clung to that knowing past all reason, past all the family's gentle attempts to make her accept the comfortable lie of the small grave, insisting to the end that her child was alive somewhere in the world and must be found. They had thought her grief had unhinged her. They had been wrong. She had been right, more right than any of them. Her child was alive, and her instinct true. But no one had believed her, and she had worn herself out in a grief that was also a kind of fidelity, a refusal to abandon her living child to the dark. And within the year she had died of it, died still believing and still searching, died of a broken heart and a faith no one would share. And here was the thing that Nell came to hold most precious of all the strange gifts of her homecoming, that her mother had never given up on her. Through all the years that Nell had grown up a foundling, believing herself unwanted, left on a doorstep by people who did not care. Through all those years, Unknown to her, a mother had loved her past death itself, had refused to believe her lost, had spent her last strength and her very life insisting that her stolen daughter was alive and must be sought. Nell had thought, growing up, that she had been abandoned. She learned at 23 that she had been mourned by a mother who died rather than give her up. And the learning healed a wound in her she had carried so long, she had ceased to feel it as a wound. The foundling's deep-buried ache of not having been wanted. She had been wanted. She had been wanted with a love that outlasted death. And it was that love, in the end, the forget-me-nots the dying Duchess had chosen for the christening locket, that she should never be forgotten. The portrait painted in her loveliness and hung in honor and never taken down. It was that love, reaching out of the grave across 23 years, that had drawn the daughter home and given up its secret on the wall. So that it was true to say, as Nell came to feel it deeply, that her mother had saved her after all, had reached out of death to claim her child at the last, and that the faith the world had mocked as a madwoman's grief had been, all along, the truest thing in the whole sad story. Mrs. Halloway, the old housekeeper, deserves a place near the very center of this story, for without her the truth would have had no witness and no champion, and the lost child might have been lost a second and final time. And she came to her work of saving Nell out of a love 23 years deep. She had been a young woman when she first came to Sherbourne, and had risen by long faithful service to be housekeeper in the great days, in the time of the Duchess Lavinia, whom she had served and worshipped. For Lavinia had been the kind of mistress who wins a servant's heart entirely, treating the humblest of her household with a warmth and a courtesy that the cold greats seldom show. So that Mrs. Halloway had loved her, not as a servant loves a master, but as one loves a dear friend set above one by the accident of birth. She had rejoiced at the longed-for child's coming as though it were her own, had been trusted with the infant, had stood at the christening and seen the Duchess fasten the forget-me-not locket about the tiny neck with her own hands, had wept when the child was lost as bitterly as any, had held the Duchess's hand through the year of dying, and closed her eyes at the end, and grieved her ever since. And in all the cold years after, while the house went dark, and Vance took his quiet hold, Mrs. Halloway had stayed, too old now to leave, too faithful to abandon the broken Duke, keeping the dead Duchess's rooms and the dead Duchess's memory against a day she never thought to see. So that when the day came, when the lost child walked into the gallery wearing the dead Duchess's face, there was one soul in that house who knew, beyond all of Vance's poison, exactly what she was looking at, because she had loved both faces, the mother's and now the daughter's, with the same whole heart. She was a small woman and old and of no rank or power in the world, and she set herself against the clever, wealthy, ruthless Bertram Vance with nothing but her certainty and her love, and she did not flinch, and in the end, she won. When Vance began his poison, when he hinted that the old housekeeper's wits were going, that she was a sentimental old fool who saw what she wished, Mrs. Halloway had drawn herself up to the whole of her small height, and said to his face words that Nell never forgot. "My wits are my own, Mr. Vance, and have served 40 years in this house without going anywhere, and they will serve a while yet. I held that child at her christening. I saw her mother put that locket round her neck. I have grieved her 23 years, and I knew her the instant she walked into that gallery, by her own dear face and her own dear mother's eyes, before ever I saw the locket. And there is no power on this earth, and certainly none in you, sir, that will make me unknow it. You may call me a fool. Fools have sharp memories sometimes where their hearts are concerned, and my heart remembers that baby, and it does not lie. I served the best mistress that ever drew breath, and grieved her child as dead. And now her child is come home. And I will see her in her rightful place, sir, and her mother's memory honored, if it is the last thing my old wits and my old heart accomplish in this world. And you will not stop me, for you are only wicked, and I am only loving, and love is the older and the stronger of the two, as you will discover before we are done. And she had been as good as every word, and when the clever, ruthless man and the small, old, loving woman came at last to their reckoning, it was the old, loving woman who stood, and the clever, wicked man who fell. Which is not how the world usually runs, but is how it ran that once, and ought to run oftener. There was a man in that house, however, to whom the rising of this buried truth was not a joy but a catastrophe. And to understand the danger that now gathered about Nell, you must understand Mr. Bertram Vance and what he had done 23 years before. For the lost child of Sherbourne had not been lost at all. She had been stolen, coldly, deliberately, for gain. And the man who had stolen her was the same smooth, attentive cousin who now stood to inherit the whole Sherbourne fortune, and who had spent 2 decades making himself indispensable to the grief he had himself created. Bertram Vance had been, in those days, a poor relation of the great house, a clever, ambitious younger cousin with expensive tastes and no fortune of his own, who had calculated, with the cold patience that was his chief gift, exactly what stood between himself and the vast, unentailed wealth of Sherbourne. Only the Duke's longed-for child. While the Duke and Duchess had no heir, Vance, as nearest male cousin, was heir presumptive to the fortune. The birth of the daughter had dashed his every expectation at a stroke. And Vance, rather than accept the ruin of his hopes, had done the unforgivable thing. He had arranged, through a hired woman and a corrupt nurse, in the confusion of a journey he had himself contrived, the disappearance of the infant heiress, had the child carried off and given away far off among the poor to people who would ask no questions, with a sum of money and a lie, and had arranged the evidence so that the family believed the babe had died and been lost, and had stood by with a sorrowing face while the Duchess wasted and died, and the Duke broke and withdrew, and the fortune that the child had stood between him and fell, year by patient year, back within his grasp. He had not murdered the child. He had told himself, in the cold chambers of his heart, that he was no murderer, that he had merely removed her, that what became of a nameless infant among the poor was no concern of his. And he had lived 23 years on the strength of that distinction, growing rich and powerful and secure, the trusted cousin, the indispensable man, the heir, while the true heiress scrubbed linen in a carter's cottage and never knew her name. And now she had come back, by a chance so monstrous that Vance, when the news reached him, went white to the lips, the chance that the grown child, knowing nothing, drawn by God knew what, had taken a place as a laundry-maid in the very house from which she had been stolen, and had stood beneath her mother's portrait and been known. Now she had come back, and 23 years of careful wickedness stood on the edge of ruin. For if the laundry-maid were truly the lost daughter of Sherbourne, then Vance was heir to nothing. Worse, the manner of her loss must surely now be looked into. Worse still, there were perhaps those living, the hired woman, the corrupt nurse, some thread he had thought long since cut, who might, if the matter were stirred up, lead back to him. The found child was not merely an inconvenience to Bertram Vance. She was his exposure, his ruin, and very possibly the rope round his neck. and a man who has done murder of the soul, if not of the body, to gain a fortune, and held it 20 years, does not give it up, nor risk the gallows without a fight. Vance set his cold, clever mind to the problem within the hour of hearing, and he concluded, as such men do, that the rising truth must be pushed back down into the dark by whatever means came to hand, that the laundry-maid must be discredited, denounced, and got rid of, branded an impostor and a schemer, before she could be established as the heiress, and that he, Bertram Vance, who had buried this truth once, would simply have to bury it again. Bertram Vance deserves to be understood, insofar as such a man can be understood. For he was not a raging villain, but a cold one, and the cold ones are the more dangerous and the more instructive, for they do their evil by calculation and call it sense. He had been born to the wrong side of a great family, the son of a younger son, with the blood of Sherbourne in his veins and none of its fortune in his pocket. And he had grown up, clever and proud and bitterly ambitious, in the galling position of the poor relation, near enough to wealth to taste it, far enough to be denied it, dependent on the charity of cousins he privately despised. It had bred in him a cold, consuming hunger for the fortune that birth had dangled before him and withheld, and a cold conviction that he was cheated of his due, that the wealth ought by rights to have been his, that the world's arrangement which made him poor and his cousins rich was an injustice he was entitled to correct by any means that came to hand. And when the chance came, when, as nearest male cousin, he stood for a few years heir presumptive to the whole Sherbourne fortune, and then saw that expectation dashed by the birth of the Duke's daughter, the cold hunger had hardened into the cold resolve that does murder of the soul, and he had reasoned himself, step by careful step, into the unforgivable thing, telling himself all the while that he was no monster, that he would shed no blood, that he would merely remove an obstacle and leave the rest to chance. That was the particular evil of Bertram Vance. Not passion, but reasoning. Not a moment's madness, but a cold, sustained argument with his own conscience, carried out over weeks, at the end of which he had persuaded himself that to steal an infant and abandon her among strangers was not so very wicked, was indeed almost reasonable, given the injustice he suffered and the bloodlessness of the method. And having done it, he had not been tormented, as a man of any heart would have been. He had simply gone on, with the same cold reasoning, building his security year by year, the attentive cousin, the indispensable man, the comfort of the grieving Duke, the careful steward of the fortune he had killed a soul to gain. And he had grown so practiced in his own justification, so smooth in the part he played, that he had very nearly forgotten, in 20 years, that he was anything but the good and faithful kinsman he appeared. It was this that made his exposure so shattering to him, and his bluffing at the reckoning so nearly convincing, that he had lied so long he half believed himself. That the cold reasoning which had let him steal a child had also let him wear, for 2 decades, the face of an honest man, until the face had grown almost true. And it was this, too, that made Nell's quiet word to him at the reckoning. "I am not even angry, for I have had a happy enough life, which is more than you will have," strike so deep, for it named the thing his cold reasoning had never reckoned on, which was that the stolen child might have been happy, and he, the thief, miserable. That his whole calculation had purchased him a fortune and a hollow, and cost her nothing in the end but a name she had been happy enough without. That he had done murder of his own soul for a prize that turned, in his hand, to ash, while his victim sang at her washtub. The cold ones never reckon on that. They count everything but the cost to themselves, and it is always, in the end, the cost to themselves that ruins them. But there was another man at Sherbourne whose life the laundry-maid had already changed, though neither of them had been willing to admit it. And before we follow Vance into his wickedness, you must know about Gideon, the Duke of Carlisle, and what had been growing, against all his pride and all his intentions, between him and Nell Carey in the weeks before the portrait gave up its secret. The Duke of Carlisle was the nearest neighbor of Sherbourne, and the nearest thing to a son that the broken old Duke had left in the world. He was a young man of 31, grave and proud and self-contained, who had come into his own great title young and worn it ever since like armor. And he had a particular tie to Sherbourne, for the old Duke had been his own dead father's closest friend, and had been kind to Gideon in his motherless boyhood, and Gideon had never forgotten it. So when the old Duke withdrew into his grief and let his affairs drift into Vance's hands, it was the young Duke of Carlisle who had taken it upon himself, out of loyalty and love, to keep a watchful eye on Sherbourne, to ride over often, to look into the management of the neglected estate, to stand, as far as the old man would permit, between his broken old friend and the cold cousin whom Carlisle had never trusted. And so the Duke of Carlisle was much at Sherbourne Court, and it was there, 6 weeks before, that he had first encountered the new laundry-maid, and been thrown entirely off his guard by her. For Gideon of Carlisle was a proud man, proud of his rank, proud of his blood, raised from the cradle in the iron certainty of where a duke stood and where a laundress stood, and of the unbridgeable distance between them. And he had never in his life expected to be moved by a servant. And he was moved by Nell Carey from the first hour, and it disturbed him profoundly. He had come upon her in a passage, carrying her heavy basket, and had spoken to her as a great man speaks to a maid, carelessly, and she had answered him with perfect respect, but also with a quiet dignity, a level, clear-eyed self-possession, an unserviceable grace that had brought him up short and made him look at her, really look, for the first time. And what he had seen had unsettled him more with every subsequent meeting. For she was beautiful, but it was not the beauty, it was the quality of her, the fineness, the sense that here, in the person of a laundry-maid, was a soul of more natural nobility than he had met in 100 drawing-rooms of the great. He found himself seeking out reasons to pass through the parts of the house where she worked. He found himself remembering things she had said. He found himself, to his deep alarm, thinking about a laundress in a way that a Duke of Carlisle had no business thinking about anyone beneath the rank of an earl's daughter. And the more he felt it, the more his pride rose up against it, appalled, for he could not, must not, would not be the kind of man who entangled himself with a servant, and his whole training and station and pride forbade the thing as an impossibility and very nearly an indecency. And so the Duke of Carlisle had done what proud men do when their hearts go where their pride forbids. He had fought it badly, and been cold and short and even cruel to the girl in the violence of his fighting. He had snubbed her after one encounter in which he had found himself talking to her, easily as to an equal, for the better part of an hour, and had caught himself and been horrified, and had the next day cut her with a coldness that had brought the color to her cheek and a flash of hurt to her clear eyes that he had not been able to forget. He had told himself he despised the weakness in himself, and had let some of the contempt spill onto her. He had behaved, in short, like exactly the cold, proud, careless man that the world had made him, wounding the one person who had stirred his frozen heart in years, because he had not the courage to face what she stirred. And Nell, for her part, had drawn back into her dignity, and concluded that the young Duke of Carlisle was a proud, cold man like all his kind, who would warm to a laundress 1 hour for his own amusement and freeze her the next to remind them both of their places, and she had armored her own heart against him and been the more hurt for needing to, for she had, though she would have died sooner than own it, begun to feel something for the grave, proud young Duke that a laundress had no more business feeling than he had. That was how matters had stood between them. The cold, proud Duke and the dignified laundress, each guarding a wounded heart against the other, on the gray November afternoon when Nell walked into the locked gallery and the whole world turned over. The first encounter between the laundry-maid and the Duke of Carlisle is worth setting down in full, for it was the seed of everything that grew between them, and it showed, in little, both the pride that was his flaw and the quality in her that overthrew it. It had been in the 2nd week of her service. Nell had been carrying a great basket of wet linen across the stable court, and the basket had been too heavy, and the cobbles wet, and she had slipped and gone down, the linen scattering in the mud, and she had been on her knees gathering it, vexed and ashamed, when a shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see a tall, grave young gentleman looking down at her, the Duke of Carlisle, though she did not then know him, only that he was plainly some great personage by his dress and his bearing, and the cool, incurious way he regarded her, as a man regards a fallen basket, an object of no interest. And he had said, carelessly, "You had better mind your footing, girl. That is a deal of washing to do twice over," and made to pass on. And Nell, tired and aching and stung by the careless contempt of it, but too proud to show it, had looked up at him from the mud with a perfectly level eye, and answered, in a voice of such quiet dignity that it stopped him, "I shall do it twice over, sir, and think nothing of it. Honest work is no hardship, and a fall no shame, save to those who have never had to do any. Good day to you." And she had gone back to gathering her linen with the unhurried composure of a queen, and dismissed him. And the Duke of Carlisle, who had been dismissed by no one in his life, had found himself standing in his own astonishment, looking at a laundry-maid on her knees in the mud, who had just put him very gently and very thoroughly in his place, and had felt something turn over in him that he did not at all understand. He had thought about her all that day, and been annoyed with himself for it. He had told himself it was nothing, a pert servant, a moment's impertinence beneath his notice, and had found, the next day, that his feet carried him through the stable court again at the hour the linen was hung, and the day after that. He had begun to watch her against his will, watched the dignity with which she did her humble work, the kindness with which she spoke to the scullery children, the quick, clever attention in her face when the talk of her betters drifted her way and touched on something that interested her. And the more he watched, the more the thing that had turned over in the stable court turned again, until he could no longer pretend to himself that a Duke of Carlisle was merely idly curious about a washerwoman. And it was then that the pride had risen and the trouble begun. For the more he felt drawn to her, the more appalled his pride became at the drawing, and the more he punished her for it, sought her out to talk, despising himself, and then, horrified at his own warmth, cut her cold, until he had made of himself, in her clear eyes, exactly the proud, capricious nobleman she had taken him for in the stable court, a man who would notice a maid for his own amusement and freeze her for his own pride. He had not meant to wound her. He had been wounding himself, in truth, far worse than her, tearing at his own heart in the effort to keep it where his pride said it belonged. But the wounds had fallen on her too, and she had felt them and armored herself. And so the thing that might have grown sweetly from a meeting in a stable court had grown instead crooked and painful, twisted by a proud man's cowardice, until only the great upheaval of the portrait could straighten it. I learned in that stable court, Carlyon said to her long after, that you were worth more on your knees in the mud than I was in all my dukedom. I knew it in that minute, and spent the next 6 weeks being too proud to bear knowing it. You unmade me the first time you opened your mouth, Nell, and I have never been the same proud fool since, though I made us both wretched pretending to be. When the news broke over Sherbourne that the laundry-maid was the lost daughter, that the old Duke had owned her, that the impossible thing was true, it struck the Duke of Carlyon like a blow, and his first reaction told him, with merciless clarity, the truth about his own heart that his pride had been hiding from him. For his first feeling, on hearing it, before thought or pride or anything else could rise, was a great wild leap of pure joy. Joy that the barrier was gone. Joy that the woman he had been forbidding himself to love was, all along, no laundress at all, but the daughter of a duke, his equal, a woman he might love and marry before all the world without the smallest impropriety. Joy, in short, that he need no longer fight his heart. And the joy lasted exactly as long as it took for the next thought to follow it, and the next thought shamed him to the soul. For he saw, in the cold light of his own gladness, what his gladness meant. That he had loved her all along, had loved Nell the laundress, truly and completely, the woman herself, and had been too proud and too cowardly to own it, had wounded her and snubbed her and frozen her rather than face it, had let his miserable pride make him cruel to the one soul who had touched his heart. And that now, the instant her birth made her acceptable, he was leaping to claim what he had not had the courage to claim when it might have cost him something. He had been ready to break her heart and his own sooner than marry a laundress, and he was ready, the same hour, to offer that laundress everything, the moment she turned out to be a duke's daughter. What did that make him? Not a man who loved a woman, he thought, with a self-contempt that was the beginning of his salvation, but a man who loved a rank, who had wanted Nell all along and despised himself for wanting a laundress, and who would now want her without shame only because the world would approve. And Nell, he knew. Nell, who was clever and proud and had every reason to mistrust him, would see it exactly so. Would see a man who had scorned her in her poverty come bowing the moment she was rich, and would be right to scorn him for it in her turn. He understood, standing there, that his pride had cost him the only thing that might have made his love worth having, the chance to have offered it to her when she was nothing. Had he found the courage, 3 weeks before, to defy his pride and his rank and the whole cold world and say to a laundry-maid, "I do not care what you are. I love you. Be my wife," then his love would have been proven, beyond all doubting, a true thing, given freely to the woman herself, with no thought of gain or station. And now that proof was forever beyond his reach, for he had not given it, and any offer he made now would be tainted, in her eyes and in his own, by the suspicion that he loved the heiress and not the woman. He had been a coward when courage would have meant something. And the bitterest part of it was that he had truly loved her all the while, and let his cowardice hide it, and so had lost the power ever to prove it. It was a hard lesson, and it landed on the Duke of Carlyon with the full weight of his pride collapsing under it. And out of that collapse, slowly, over the dark days that followed, a better man began to be born. A man who understood now what his rank was worth set against a true heart, and what his pride had nearly cost him, and who resolved, too late as he feared, to spend whatever courage he had left in proving, by deeds if his word could no longer be trusted, that he had loved Nell Carey the laundress, and would have loved her had she stayed one all her life. The Duke of Carlisle had never trusted Bertram Vance, and in the weeks before the gallery gave up its secret, he had begun, quietly, to act upon that mistrust. So that when the great upheaval came, he was already half-armed against the cousin, and saw through his poison sooner than the rest. It had been instinct at first, the plain dislike of an honest man for a smooth one. Carlisle had watched Vance manage the broken old Duke for years, and something in the cousin's perfect attentiveness had always set his teeth on edge. The too ready sympathy, the too smooth counsel, the way Vance was always somehow between the old Duke and anyone who might have helped him, always the indispensable filter through which all of Sherbourne's affairs were strained. Carlisle had told himself, for a long time, that it was mere distaste, that Vance was tiresome but harmless, the kind of capable cold relation that great broken families accumulate. But in the last year, riding often to Sherbourne to keep his watchful eye on the old man's neglected estate, he had begun to see things that distaste alone could not account for. Accounts that did not quite balance, rents that did not quite arrive where they should, a slow, quiet siphoning of the Sherbourne wealth into channels that all seemed, when one looked closely, to run somewhere near Bertram Vance. He had said nothing yet, for he had no proof, only a gathering suspicion. But he had begun, in his methodical way, to look into the management of Sherbourne more closely than Vance knew, and to keep his own quiet record, so that he had been, in the weeks before Nell's revelation, already on the cold cousin's track, already half persuaded that the indispensable Mr. Vance was robbing the man he served. So when the laundry-maid proved to be the lost daughter, and Vance set instantly to discrediting her, Carlisle understood, faster than anyone, what he was seeing. Where the household saw a faithful cousin cautioning a fragile old man against a possible fraud, Carlisle saw a thief whose whole long theft was suddenly imperiled by the rightful heir's return, fighting for his life. And the very smoothness of Vance's poison, which convinced the others, only confirmed Carlisle's suspicion. For he had seen that smoothness at work before, in the accounts. He needed no persuading that Nell was true and Vance false. He had distrusted Vance for years and loved Nell for weeks, and the two certainties locked together in an instant into a single clear picture of what was happening and who was behind it. And it was this, as much as his love, that nerved him for the hard reckoning with his own cowardice, and brought him galloping to Sherbourne on the day of Nell's renouncing. For he had resolved not merely to claim the woman he loved, but to throw the whole weight of his rank and his name and his gathering evidence against the cousin he had marked, and to stand between Nell and Vance as he had long wished to stand between the old Duke and Vance, and could now at last find both the cause and the courage to do. He came that day, not as a man rushing blindly to a rescue, but as a man who had seen the enemy clearly for a long time, and meant, at last, to engage him. And if his love gave him his courage, it was his long, honest watchfulness that gave him his aim. The proud, and the cowardly, and the careless he had been. But he had never been a fool about Bertram Vance, and in the end, it was the conjunction of the two, the lover newly brave, and the neighbor long watchful, that brought the cold cousin down. But Bertram Vance was not idle while hearts were reckoning with themselves, and within a few days he had set in motion a scheme to destroy Nell Carey utterly, and it was very nearly successful. He went to work, first and most cunningly, upon the broken mind of the old Duke himself. For the Duke of Sherbourne, in the first rapture of believing his lost child restored, was a man transformed. but he was also a man worn thin by 23 years of grief, fragile, half-broken, terrified above all things of having his hope raised only to be dashed. And Vance, who knew him better than anyone, played upon that terror with diabolical skill. He came to the old Duke with a grave, sorrowful, loving face, and counseled caution. Oh, such tender, reasonable, poisonous caution. Was it not, he asked, almost too wonderful to be true? And were not the two wonderful things so often precisely the false ones? Here was a laundry-maid, a clever, ambitious laundry-maid, who had taken a place in the house, and then, how very conveniently, discovered a resemblance to the late Duchess, and produced a locket, and claimed the whole vast Sherbourne inheritance. Did the dear Duke not see how it might look to a colder eye? How many such impostors had fastened on grieving great families down the years, with their convenient resemblances, and their planted tokens, and their tales? He, Vance, longed to believe it as much as anyone, more, far more, for had he not loved the lost child too? But he could not bear, he simply could not bear, to see his beloved cousin's poor heart broken a second time by a scheming adventuress, and he begged the Duke, for his own protection, to make no acknowledgment, to settle nothing, to sign nothing, until the matter had been most rigorously proved, and to let him, Vance, the faithful cousin, undertake the proving, that the dear Duke might be spared the pain of it. And the old Duke, fragile and frightened, and trusting the cousin who had stood by him 20 years, and terrified above all of the cruelty of a false hope, had wavered, had drawn back from his daughter by degrees into a tormented uncertainty, and Vance had his opening. For Vance, given the office of proving the matter, set about disproving it instead with cold thoroughness. He moved to discredit Mrs. Halloway, the chief witness, as a sentimental old woman whose wits were going, easily imposed upon, half blind, who saw what she wished to see. He cast doubt upon the locket. Might not such a thing be come by, copied, stolen, planted? Where was the proof it was the true one, and not a forgery got up to match a description any servant might have gleaned? He set inquiries afoot, ostensibly to trace the girl's origins and confirm the tale, in truth to muddy and bury them, and he had the means and the cunning to ensure those inquiries led nowhere or led astray. And above all, he worked tirelessly on opinion, on the household, on the family connections summoned to consider the matter, on the county, spreading everywhere, with sorrowful reluctance, the picture of the grasping laundry-maid and the imposed-upon old man, until the very people who should have welcomed Nell looked at her askance as a probable adventuress, and the wonderful homecoming curdled within a week into a thing under suspicion. And Nell, who had asked for none of it, who had wanted only the father whose arms had felt like the home she had never had, found herself, by Vance's slow poison, transformed in the eyes of the great house from a daughter restored into a schemer on trial, found the old Duke's eyes that had wept with joy upon her grow troubled and doubtful and afraid, found the doors that had opened to her beginning, one by one, to close. The days of Vance's poison were the bitterest Nell had known, worse in their way than any hardship of her poverty. For poverty she had understood and could bear. But this, to be given a father and a name and a belonging, the very things she had ached for her whole life, and then to watch them turn to suspicion and be slowly taken away. This was a cruelty she had no defense against, and it nearly broke even her steady heart. She felt the change come on by degrees as a chill comes into a season. At first, after the gallery, the whole house had been hers, the servants weeping with joy, the old Duke unable to let her go. The doors all open, the long nightmare ended. And then, day by day, as Vance's careful poison spread, she felt the warmth withdraw. A servant who had wept over her grew cool and watchful. A door that had opened was found shut. The family connections who came to look at her looked now not with welcome, but with appraisal, weighing her, suspecting her, their faces saying plainly what Vance had taught them to think. A clever laundry-maid, a convenient resemblance, a planted locket, a scheme. And worst of all, immeasurably worst, was the change in her father's face. The old eyes that had wept upon her with such joy grew troubled, then doubtful, then frightened. He would look at her sometimes with a terrible, wavering uncertainty, wanting to believe, terrified to believe, his fragile, newly mended heart pulled to pieces between his daughter and his cousin's poison. And once, the thing that hurt her most of all, the hurts of those days, he had drawn back from her embrace, just slightly, just for an instant, with a flicker of doubt in his eyes before catching himself. And Nell had seen it and felt it like a knife, and understood that Vance was winning, that the precious thing she had found was being poisoned at its root, and she could do nothing. That was the helplessness of it. She could not fight Vance with his own weapons, for she had none. She had no cleverness of intrigue, no wealth, no power, no friends in that great house, but an old housekeeper and an absent young duke. She had only the truth, and the truth, she was learning, is a poor weapon against a skilled and determined liar, slow and quiet, where the lie is quick and loud. She could not even defend herself without seeming to grasp. For the more she insisted she was the daughter, the more it served Vance's picture of the scheming adventuress pressing her claim. Her very truth, in his clever framing, became evidence against her. She felt herself sinking, day by day, in a web she could not tear, watching the doors close, and her father's face cloud, and her brief belongings slip away. And she understood, with a sick certainty, that she was losing, that Vance would win, that she would be cast out as an impostor, that she would lose her father and her name and go back to the washtubs with nothing, and that there was nothing, nothing that she could do to prevent it. It was in that pit of helplessness, that conviction that all was lost, that she made the decision that paradoxically saved everything. The decision to stop fighting and to go, to renounce the whole disputed inheritance and remove herself, sooner than be the cause of her father's torment. The decision that, in giving up everything, proved her worth past all of Vance's lies, and brought the Duke of Carlisle to her side, and turned the whole tide. But she did not know that when she made it. She knew only that she was beaten, and would not grasp at a thing that brought her father pain. And she made, out of the depth of her defeat, the most generous and dignified choice of her life, expecting nothing from it but the bitter peace of having done right. It is the measure of Nell Carey, and the truest proof, had anyone been looking for one, of the nobility that was in her long before her birth was known, that her response to all this was not to grasp, but to let go. For she saw, with her clear, unflinching eye, exactly what was happening, saw the suspicion gathering, the doubt in her father's frightened face, the cold, patient malice of the cousin Vance, whom she had marked from the first as her enemy. And she found that she could not bear it, not the loss of the fortune. She had never in her life thought of the fortune, and did not begin now. What was a fortune to a girl who had been happy enough washing linen and had never known she lacked anything grander? But the thing she could not bear was to be the cause of a fresh grief to the broken old man who was her father. To see the hope she had brought him turn, through Vance's poison, into a torment of doubt. To be fought over, suspected, weighed like a counterfeit coin, in the very house where she had for one shining hour been simply, joyfully known. She had not come to Sherbourne to claim anything. She had come to wash linen and had stumbled into a truth she had not sought. And if that truth was to bring nothing but suspicion and strife and a fresh wound to her father's heart, then she would far rather give it up and go quietly back to the honest poverty she understood and leave them their peace. And so she went to her father, past Vance, who tried to prevent it. And she said to him, with a dignity that should have shamed every doubter in that house, "I will go away, father. I see that my coming has brought you only doubt and trouble, and a fear of being deceived, and I cannot bear to be the cause of one more sorrow to you who have had sorrow enough. So I will go. I want you to know before I do that I never came here to claim anything. I did not know who I was. I came to wash your linen and would have washed it gladly all my days and never troubled you. I do not want your fortune. I have never wanted it. I would not take a penny of it if you laid it at my feet. I wanted only what I felt for one moment in that gallery, which was to be your child, and to belong somewhere at last, after a whole life of belonging nowhere. But I would rather give up even that, give up the father I have just found, than be a grief and a doubt to you. For I find that loving you, even for an hour, has taught me to want your peace more than my own happiness, which I am told is what it is to be a daughter, and what I never had the chance to learn. So I will go and trouble you no more, and I will keep, all my life, the memory of the 1 hour you held me and called me yours, and it will be enough. It will have to be enough. Goodbye, father. Be at peace." And she had kissed his old hand and turned to go back to Marbury and the washtubs and the honest poverty, with nothing but a memory and a locket. And it was at that moment, with the lost child about to be lost a second time by her own free renouncing, that two things happened at once, which together undid the whole of Bertram Vance's wickedness. The first was that the Duke of Carlisle, who had heard of Vance's poison and of Nell's renouncing, arrived at Sherbourne at the gallop and walked into that room and found his courage at last. He had spent the dark days since the reveal in a hard reckoning, and he had come out of it changed. And he had resolved that since he had been a coward when courage might have proved his love, he would at least not be a coward now when courage might save her. So he came into the room where Nell stood with her father's hand at her lips, about to give up everything, and he heard her renounce the fortune she might have grasped at, and the sound of it, that she would walk away from a dukedom's wealth sooner than wound the father she had just found, broke the last of his pride to pieces. And he did, before them all, the thing he should have had the courage to do when she was a laundress. He crossed the room and took Nell's hand and turned to the old Duke and said, in a voice that rang, "Sir, before this goes one step further, there is a thing this company must know, and I am ashamed it has taken me so long to find the courage to say it. I loved your daughter before any of us knew whose daughter she was. I loved her when she was Nell Carey, the laundry-maid, with nothing in the world but a silver locket and more natural nobility than the whole of this doubting house put together. I was too proud and too great a coward to own it then, and I wounded her for it, and I will carry the shame of that always, but I will not be a coward twice. I do not care, sir. I never cared, that is the truth I hid even from myself, whether she is a duke's daughter or a carter's. I would marry her tomorrow if she went back to the washtubs this hour with nothing to her name. And I say so now, before you settle one question of her birth. Precisely so that no one in this room, least of all she, can ever say that I came courting an heiress. I am not courting an heiress. I am asking a laundry-maid I love to forgive a proud fool and to be my wife. And her birth may be whatever it will and change nothing. And the room went silent, and Nell, who had armored her heart against this man, felt the armor fall, for she heard the truth in it and knew that he had timed it, had flung his love and his rank into the scale on the side of the penniless, renouncing girl and against the heiress, exactly so that it could never be doubted, and that he had given her, by his courage now, the one proof his cowardice had seemed to put forever out of reach. And the second thing happened in the same hour, and it was Mrs. Halloway who brought it. Mrs. Halloway, who had not been idle under Vance's slanders, but had been quietly doing the one thing that could end them. For the old housekeeper had remembered something, that on the dreadful journey 23 years before, the corrupt nurse who had vanished with the child had had a sister, a laundry-maid herself, still living in service 2 counties off. And Mrs. Halloway had written to her and gone to her, and the woman, old now and dying, and with a guilty conscience she had carried half her life, had at last confessed the whole of it, and signed it before a clergyman and a magistrate, that the child had not died, that she had been carried off by the nurse and given to a traveling woman with a sum of money to leave her among the poor far away, and that the man who had paid for the doing of it, the man who had planned and ordered the whole wicked business, was Mr. Bertram Vance. Mrs. Halloway had the signed confession in her hand when she came into that room, and she laid it before the old Duke and the assembled family and the magistrate Vance had so confidently summoned to denounce the impostor. And the trap that Bertram Vance had set to bury the truth a second time closed instead upon Bertram Vance. Sus. The confession that broke Bertram Vance did not fall from heaven. It was hunted down, patiently and bravely, by a small old woman who would not be beaten, and the manner of its finding deserves to be told, for it was Mrs. Halloway's finest hour. She had understood, sooner than Nell herself, that the matter would never be settled by face and locket alone, that against a liar as practiced as Vance, resemblances could be doubted and tokens called forgeries, and that what was needed was proof of the one thing Vance could not explain away. Proof of how the child had been taken, and by whom. And she had set herself, old as she was and slandered as she was, to find it. She had gone back, in her memory, over the dreadful time 23 years before, sifting it for any thread. And she had remembered, at last, the nurse, the young woman who had had charge of the infant on the fatal journey, who had vanished from Sherbourne immediately after and never been heard of since, and whom everyone had assumed lost or dead in the same catastrophe that took the child. Mrs. Halloway had never quite believed that nurse as innocent as the family had supposed. There had been something in the woman's flight that had always troubled her. And now, with Vance's poison teaching her at last to think the unthinkable, she saw it plainly. The nurse had been bought. The nurse had been part of it. And if the nurse yet lived, the nurse could tell the truth. So the old housekeeper, telling no one but Carlyon, had begun to hunt. She had remembered that the vanished nurse had had a sister, also in service, somewhere to the north. She had written letters, spent her own small savings on a messenger, followed the cold trail of a woman gone 20 years, with nothing but an old servant's memory for names and places, and the dogged refusal of a loving heart to give up. And the trail had led, at last, to a dying woman in a poor lodging 2 counties off. Not the nurse herself, who was some years dead, but the sister, who had known the whole of it, who had carried the guilty knowledge half her life, and found it heavy on her as the end drew near. Mrs. Halloway had gone to her and sat by her bed, and told her of the lost child come home, and the wicked man who would bury her again. And the dying woman, glad at the last to set down her burden, had told the whole truth, how her sister the nurse had been paid by Mr. Bertram Vance to give the infant to a traveling woman and swear the child had perished. How the money had come from Vance, and the orders from Vance, and the whole cold scheme been Vance's from first to last. And she had let a clergyman write it down, and a magistrate witness it, and had signed it with her dying hand. And Mrs. Halloway had carried that paper back to Sherbourne pressed against her heart, as once she had longed to carry the lost baby, and had kept it close and said nothing, waiting for the hour when it would do the most good, and when Vance, in his confidence, summoned his magistrate to denounce the impostor and finish her. The old housekeeper had walked into the very trap he had set and sprung it shut upon him, laying the dead woman's confession before the law he had so foolishly invited. It was, all agreed, a remarkable thing for a woman of her years and station to have accomplished, alone, against such a man. But Mrs. Halloway herself never thought it remarkable at all. "I promised her mother I would mind her," she said, meaning the Duchess. "With my own heart, at the christening, when I held her. And I am a woman who keeps her promises, that is all, even the ones that take 23 years and a journey of 2 counties to keep. There is nothing remarkable in keeping faith. It is only that so few trouble to do it. And so when one old woman does, the world is surprised, when it ought to be ashamed that the thing is rare." What followed in that great room before the assembled family and the county magistrate was the public reckoning that Vance had meant for Nell, turned inside out and visited upon himself. And it was Nell, the laundress, the renouncing girl who had wanted nothing, who owned that room in the end, though she had never sought to. For Vance, seeing the confession laid before the magistrate, did the thing that guilty men do when the ground gives way. He bluffed and bullied and denounced the confession as a dying woman's spite, the locket as a forgery, the whole affair as a conspiracy of a senile housekeeper and a scheming laundress and a love-blinded young duke against an honest man's good name. He was clever and cold and very nearly convincing, for he had 23 years' practice at the lie. And it was then that Nell stepped forward. Nell, who might have stood silent and let the men fight it out over her, and who instead, quietly, with the unservile dignity that had unsettled Carlyon from the first hour, claimed her own voice and her own truth before them all. "I will not stand here and be called a schemer," she said, and her clear voice filled the room and stilled it. "By the man who stole me from my cradle. I did not come to this house to claim a fortune, sir. You know that better than anyone, for you know what I am, having made me it. I came to wash linen, knowing nothing, wanting nothing, and I found my own face upon a wall, and a father in his grief, and I have asked for nothing since but to be let love him. And not an hour ago, before this gentleman found his courage." She did not look at Carlyon, but her hand tightened in his. "I was leaving this house with my locket and the clothes on my back, and not 1 penny of the fortune you are so afraid I have come for, because I would sooner have gone back to my washtubs forever than bring one more grief to my father's heart. That is the scheming adventuress you would have this company believe in. Look at me, sir, and tell these gentlemen I lie. You cannot, for it is you who have lied, for 23 years, lied to a grieving man and a dying woman and a stolen child. And I find I am not even angry in the end, for I have had a happy enough life among honest poor people who loved me, which is more than you will have, with your fortune and your lie, in whatever years are left you. I do not want your ruin, sir. I never wanted anything of yours. I want only what was always mine, my father and my name, and the right to be known for what I am. And I have them now, whatever you say, for my father knows me, and the truth is told, and no lie of yours can bury it a second time. You have lost, Mr. Vance. Not because I beat you, I never tried to, but because the truth was always going to rise, however deep you buried it. It only wanted a portrait and a locket and an honest old woman and time. It always rises. You should have known it would. And she had turned from him with a quiet finality that was more crushing than any rage. And the magistrate had risen, and Bertram Vance, exposed, abandoned, his 23 years' wickedness laid bare before the county, was taken away to answer for it at the law. Not by Nell's contriving, who asked for no revenge, but by the plain operation of the justice he had so long evaded. And the room that he had filled with his poison was left to the daughter he had wronged, who had won it without once raising her voice in anything but truth. When the room had cleared and the magistrate gone, and the old Duke had wept his daughter back into his arms, with no doubt left in him now to trouble it, there remained the matter between Nell and the Duke of Carlisle. And Nell, though her heart had heard the truth in his courage, would not be won until she had tested it to the bottom, for she had been wounded once and was nobody's fool. "You said a brave thing today," she told him when they were private. "And I believe it was true, for you timed it so it could only be true, before my birth was proved, on the side of the girl with nothing, and I honor you for it. For I know what your pride cost you to break, and I know you broke it. But I must ask you one thing more, and you must answer it as truly as you spoke before them all. For a little while ago, you were a man who would freeze a laundress in a passage sooner than let the world see a Duke of Carlisle stoop to her. And now you are a man who will marry her before the county. And I must know which of those men is asking me. For I will not marry the one, and I will marry the other gladly, and they have the same face, and I must be sure. Tell me, Gideon, if that confession had never come, if the magistrate had believed Vance, and I had been driven out of this house tomorrow as an impostor, with no father and no name and no fortune, back to the washtubs of Marbury with nothing but my locket, would you have come after me? Would the Duke of Carlisle have followed a discredited laundry-maid to a carter's cottage and married her there in the face of the whole world's scorn, with nothing to gain and everything to lose? For that is the man I will marry. The other, the one who wants me now that it is safe, I would not have, though he came with a crown. And the Duke of Carlisle answered her without an instant's hesitation, for he had asked himself that very question in his dark reckoning, and knew the answer to the bottom of his soul. "I would have followed you to Marbury," he said, "and married you in the carter's cottage, and counted the world's scorn a small price, and never looked back. I know it, because in the hour before that confession came, when you were a discredited laundress about to be driven out with nothing, that is exactly what I had resolved to do. I came here today not knowing the confession existed, meaning only to claim a penniless girl the whole house was calling a fraud, and to take her away and marry her and let the world say what it liked. The confession changed nothing for me. It only spared us the cottage, which I confess I do not regret for your sake, who have washed linen enough. I did not find my courage when it was safe, Nell. I found it when it was most dangerous, when loving you meant losing everything, as it nearly did. That is the man asking you. The other one, the proud fool who froze you in the passage, I have left him behind, and I am not sorry, and I will spend my life making you forget I was ever him." And Nell looked into his face and weighed it with the clear, honest judgment that was hers, whether she was called Carey or Sherbourne, and found it true to the bottom. And she chose him, freely, from the fullness of a heart that needed no rescuing, for she had her father now and her name, and could have lived whole without any man, and chose this one not from need, but because she loved him, and he had, at the last and at the hardest, loved her bravely and for herself. "Then, yes," she said, and smiled at him, the first free smile she had given him since the passage where he had frozen her. "Yes, Gideon, the brave one may have me, and welcome. I had given up on him, you know. I thought he was only the proud one wearing a kinder face. I am very glad to have been wrong. Come, let us go and tell my father. I find I like saying it, my father. I have waited 23 years to have someone to say it to." The years that followed were, for the Duke of Sherbourne, like the lifting of a long winter, for he got back in his old age not merely a daughter, but a reason to live, and the great mournful house that had been a tomb for 23 years became, by slow degrees, a home again, with light in its windows and a young voice in its halls, and, before very long, the laughter of grandchildren on the stairs, where the laughter had died. For Nell, Lady Genevieve, as she was now properly to be called, for that was the name her mother had christened her, the name on the register beneath the date of the lost child's birth, restored to her at last, along with everything else. Nell took her place as the daughter of Sherbourne with the same quiet dignity she had brought to the washtubs, neither grasping at her new grandeur, nor pretending to a shame she did not feel for her old poverty. She would answer to Genevieve, for her father's sake, who loved to say the name he had thought never to use. But she remained Nell to those who had loved her as Nell, and would not have it otherwise. And the first thing she did with her restored fortune, before a gown was bought or a single grand thing done, was to send for the Careys, her foster parents, Martha the laundress and Tom the carter, who had taken in an abandoned infant on a winter night and raised her with all the love they had, and never asked a thing in return, and she settled upon them a comfortable independence for the rest of their days, and a cottage near Sherbourne, and brought them into her new life with honor, and would hear not one word against it from anyone who thought a duke's daughter ought to be ashamed of a carter and a washerwoman. "They are my family," she said simply, "as much as my father is, and more than my blood ever was until 6 weeks ago. For blood gave me a face and a fortune, but the Careys gave me love and a life and everything I am that is worth anything, and I will honor the one as much as the other, and any who do not like it may keep their opinion. For I did not get my dignity from a coronet, and I shall not lose it by remembering where I learned it." And the old Duke, hearing her say it, had looked at his found daughter with a pride that went past the grave to her mother, and thought that Lavinia would have loved her, and loved the Careys too, for raising the child so well that no grandeur could spoil her. The great world, when it learned the whole astonishing story, did what the great world always does with a thing it cannot place. It watched the new Lady Genevieve narrowly, hungry for a misstep, half hoping the laundress would betray herself by some vulgarity and prove that blood without breeding was no true nobility after all. And it was disappointed, for Nell gave it nothing to feed on but her own quiet dignity, and won it over in the end, not by aping its manners, but by simply being, visibly, better than most of it. There was a great dinner, some weeks after the reckoning, the first at which the restored daughter of Sherbourne was presented to the assembled county, and the rooms were full of people come, half of them, to see whether the washerwoman's foundling would disgrace herself. One great lady in particular, a cold and consequential personage, much given to the worship of birth, had let it be known beforehand that she for one would reserve her judgment, and that 20 years of soapsuds were not to be undone by the discovery of a christening register, and that she expected to be embarrassed. And she had positioned herself at the dinner to observe the upstart and to administer at the right moment some delicate correction that should put the creature in her place. And the moment had come, over the soup, when the great lady had remarked, in a carrying voice, with a thin smile, that it must be very strange for dear Lady Genevieve to find herself at such a table, after, she understood, so very humble a beginning. How did one accustom oneself, she wondered, to the change? And the room had stilled a little, scenting the cruelty, and waited. And Nell had set down her spoon, and answered her pleasantly, without the smallest discomposure. "Not so strange as you might think, madam, for I find the chief difference between this table and the one I was raised at is the quantity of silver. And silver was never the part of a meal I valued most. The people who raised me taught me that a table is for honesty and kindness and the breaking of bread among those who wish one another well. And I have found that this holds equally true whether the bread is brown or white, and the company humble or great, or rather, I should say, it holds true wherever the company is kind, which I am happy to find is most places and most people of every station. I accustom myself very easily, madam, because I was taught the things that matter at a washtub, and they turn out to be the same things that matter at a duchess's table. Only the plate is finer. I am sure you were taught the same, in your own nursery, by some good soul. For kindness and honesty are not, after all, the property of any one rank, but the birthright of every decent person, high or low, and I have met them as often in a cottage as a castle, and their absence, too, in both." And she had smiled and taken up her spoon again, and the great lady had found, somehow, that there was nothing whatever to be said, that the upstart had agreed with her so graciously and so completely, while turning the whole point on its head, that to pursue it would be only to expose herself, and she had subsided, routed without a blow struck, while the cleverer heads at the table hid their smiles. And the county, which loves nothing so much as to see a self-important personage quietly bested, took Nell to its heart from that evening, and pronounced that whatever her beginnings, the new Lady Genevieve was a lady to the bone, which was true, and always had been. Only the county, like the great lady, had needed to be shown that the boniness of a lady has nothing to do with her blood. There was, in the Sherbourne chapel, a small grave that had no body in it, and the story of that grave, and of what became of it, is one of the tenderest threads of the whole tale. It had been made in the year of the great loss, when the searching had stopped and the family had been brought, against the Duchess's protest, to accept the comfortable belief that the lost infant had died. There being no body, for there had never been a body, the child being alive and far away, they had made an empty grave, a tiny one, with a small white stone, in the Sherbourne chapel, where the dukes and duchesses of the line lay buried, and they had held a service over the empty earth, and carved upon the little stone the child's name and the single year that was supposed to span her whole brief life. And the Duchess Lavinia, who had never believed it, had refused to the end to go near it, saying it was a lie carved in stone, and she would not pray over an empty box while her child lived somewhere in the world unfound. After Lavinia's death, the old Duke had gone there often in his long grief, to mourn the daughter he believed beneath the little stone. It had been one of the stations of his sorrow, the empty grave and the locked gallery, the two altars of his 23 years of mourning. And now the child the grave was made for stood living above it in her wedding clothes. For Nell was married in that chapel by her own choice and her father's, within sight of the small false grave. And before the wedding, the old Duke had taken her there, and the two of them had stood together over the little white stone with its lying date. And he had said, "I have wept here 23 years over a child I thought was under this stone, and the child was alive all the while, and is standing beside me now in her bridal veil. I think we may have it taken up, my dear, and the stone with it. For it was always a lie, as your mother said, and she would be glad to see it gone. And where there was an empty grave and a false grief, there shall be nothing now, only the clean earth, and the living daughter walking over it to her wedding." And so the little stone was taken up, and the small empty grave filled in, the one false note in all the chapel made right at last. And Nell walked over the place where it had been, living and loved and about to be wed, and felt that she was somehow completing the thing her mother had refused to accept, undoing the lie, proving the faith, turning the false grave back into plain ground, because the child it mourned had come home alive. It was, she thought, the strangest and sweetest of all the strange, sweet things of her homecoming, to stand at her own grave on her wedding day and find it empty and have it taken away, because she was not dead after all, and never had been, and was about to begin, at 23, the life that the little stone had pretended to end before it started. There was a quiet conversation before the wedding between the old Duke and the Duke of Carlisle that neither ever fully repeated, but that changed the older man's last years for the better, for in giving away his daughter, the Duke of Sherbourne gained, he said, a son. Carlisle had gone to him to ask, formally and humbly, for Nell's hand. Though they were already pledged, he would not slight the father by omitting it, and had begun by confessing frankly the whole of his earlier cowardice, how he had loved Nell as a laundress and been too proud to own it, how he had wounded her, how he was ashamed. And the old Duke had heard him out and then said, "You have told me your worst, unasked, when you might have hidden it. That is the act of an honest man, and it is worth more to me than if you had never had a fault. I do not want a son-in-law who never failed. I want one who fails honestly and mends it bravely, as you have done, for that is the only kind of goodness that survives contact with a real life, and my daughter has had enough of the other kind, the smooth, unfailing kind, in Bertram Vance, to last her forever. Take her, and welcome, and be good to her, and know that you do not merely marry my daughter, you become my son. For I have wanted one these 23 years, and never thought to have one, and I find that you will do very well." And the two men had clasped hands, and the old Duke, who had begun the year a broken recluse mourning a dead child, found himself, by its end, with a living daughter, a son to follow him, and the prospect of grandchildren on the stairs. The whole of the family that grief had stolen given back to him, pressed down and overflowing, in a single miraculous turn of the wheel. And he said, more than once in his contented last years, that no man had ever been so poor for so long, and then so suddenly, so rich, and that he meant to spend whatever time was left him being grateful, having spent quite enough of his life being sad. She married the Duke of Carlisle that spring, in the Sherbourne chapel, within sight of the small, empty grave that had been made for the lost child 23 years before, and might now, the old Duke said, be filled in at last, since the child it mourned was standing at the altar in her wedding clothes. And it was a love match, proven past all doubting, between a man who had loved a laundress when it cost him everything, and a woman who had made him prove it to the bottom before she would have him. And the soundest marriages, as the dowager aunts of the county observed, are the ones built on that kind of proving. The portrait of the Duchess Lavinia was moved, at Nell's wish, from the locked gallery of mourning to the bright morning room where the family gathered, the crape taken from its frame at last, so that the face that had revealed the truth looked down now not upon grief, but upon joy, upon her living daughter and her grandchildren, and the home come back to life. And Nell would stand before it sometimes, the silver locket at her throat, and look up at the mother she had never known, and the face that was her own, and feel the strange completion of it, that the truth had risen, as truth does, and the lost had been found, and the dead, in a manner, restored. As for the silver locket, the forget-me-nots, the engraved L, the one poor token that a dying mother's love had pinned to a stolen infant so that she should never be wholly lost. Nell wore it all her life and gave it, in time, to her own eldest daughter, with the whole of the story, for she had learned, in her strange life, the thing she most wished her children to know, that the worth of a person is a thing they carry in themselves and not in their station, that she had been the same Nell, the same soul, exactly as much a lady when she washed linen in a carter's cottage as when she sat at a duke's table, and that the portrait and the locket and the fortune had changed nothing of what she was, but had only, at long last, let the world see it. "I was a lady before I was a lady," she would say to her children, smiling when they begged the story. "Remember that, my dears, of yourselves and of everyone, for the world will always try to tell you that a person's worth is written in their station, and the world is always wrong. The worth is written in the soul, and no station can give it, and no poverty can take it, and the only difference a name makes is whether or not the world troubles to look." Of all the scenes of Nell's restored life, the one the old servants loved best to tell of afterward was the day the Careys came to Sherbourne. The day the carter and the washerwoman who had raised the lost heiress came up the great drive in their plain clothes, and the two halves of Nell's life, the high and the low, met at last beneath the portrait of her mother. She had sent for them the moment the trouble was past, and she had been firm against all advice on the manner of their coming. There were those in the great house, fewer now that Vance was gone, but some, who hinted that perhaps the carter and the washerwoman might be settled quietly somewhere at a distance, comfortably provided for, but not, perhaps, brought openly to Sherbourne, where their plainness might embarrass a duke's daughter before the county. And Nell had heard them out, and then said, in the level voice that ended discussions, that the Careys would come to Sherbourne as honored guests by the front door and be received by the family, and that anyone who found the carter and the washerwoman embarrassing was welcome to absent themselves from the embarrassment permanently if they liked. For these two had given her everything she was, and she would no more hide them than she would hide her own right hand, and there was an end of it. And so the Careys had come up the great drive in their Sunday best, awkward and overawed. Poor Tom turning his hat in his big hands, and Martha very near to tears. And Nell had run down the great steps to meet them, a duke's daughter in a fine gown running like a girl, and thrown her arms about the washerwoman who had raised her, and wept on her shoulder, and led them both in by the front door of the house she had been stolen from, with her head high and her hand in Martha's red work-roughened one. And the meeting of the old Duke and the Careys was a thing that those who saw it never forgot. For the Duke of Sherbourne, a duke of 40 descents, the head of one of the greatest houses in England, had come down to meet the carter and the washerwoman who had raised his daughter, and he had taken Tom Carey's great rough hand in both his own thin old ones, and been unable, for a moment, to speak. And then he had said, in a voice that shook, "Sir, Madam, I do not know how to thank you. You found my child abandoned on a winter night, with nothing, a stranger's babe, And you took her in, and fed her when you had little enough yourselves, and raised her in love, and made of her. His voice broke. Made of her the finest woman I have ever known, when she might have come to any misery in the world, and you asked nothing, and expected nothing, and did it only out of the goodness of your hearts. There is no thanks adequate to that. There is no fortune that repays it. You have given me back my daughter, not merely living, but good, and whole, and happy, which is more than I could have done myself had I kept her. God forgive me. And as long as I live, this house and everything in it is as much yours as mine, and you will never want for anything, and you will come and go here as my own kin, for that is what you are. You are the people who saved my child, and there is no nearer kin than that. And Martha Carey had wept outright, and Tom had wrung the old Duke's hand, and managed only, "She were always a good girl, your grace, no trouble to anyone, a joy to us." And the two old men, the Duke and the carter, so far apart in all the world counts, had stood together in perfect understanding, joined by the child they had each, in their different ways, loved and raised. And Nell, watching her two fathers clasp hands beneath her mother's portrait, had thought her heart would burst with the fullness of it. It was the truest wedding of the whole story, the old servant said. Not the grand one in the chapel that came after, but that one in the great hall, when the high and the low met over the child they shared, and found they were, in the only thing that mattered, exactly the same. People who had loved a little girl, and wanted nothing for it but her happiness. In the years that followed, when the house had come back to life, and the grandchildren were growing, and the long winter of Sherbourne was well and truly past, there was a habit the old Duke and his daughter fell into, of an evening, that the household came to know and love. The two of them standing together before the portrait of the Duchess Lavinia in the bright morning room, talking quietly to the painted face as though she could hear, telling her the day's small news. It had begun, perhaps, as a way of healing the old Duke's grief, of turning the portrait from a thing of mourning into a presence of the family, so that the wife and mother who had been the heart of the house in life might be the heart of it again, in another way, after all the dark years. But it had become something dearer than that, something Nell came to treasure, a way of knowing the mother she had never known. For the old Duke, standing before the portrait with his daughter, would tell Lavinia things, would say, "Look, my love, she has your laugh. Did you hear it just now? It is yours exactly. I had forgotten it until I heard it in her." And so, by such small offerings, he gave his daughter, piece by piece, the mother that death had stolen. This gesture is hers, that turn of phrase, this kindness, that way of tilting her head when she listens. Nell, who had grown up with no mother at all, and then with the bitter knowledge that her true mother had died grieving for her, found in these quiet evenings the strangest and most healing of gifts, the assembling, out of an old man's loving memory and a painted face, of the woman whose blood and whose features, and, it seemed, whose very laugh she carried, so that the mother she had lost before memory was given back to her, not in the flesh, which could not be, but in the slow, tender accumulation of 100 small rememberings, until Lavinia was as real and as present to her, almost, as if she had known her, until she could feel, standing before the portrait with the locket at her throat, that she was not after all a woman who had never had a mother, but a woman whose mother had loved her past death and watched over her somehow through all the lost years, and reached out of the grave to bring her home, and was with her still, in the blood and the laugh and the loving memory and the painted eyes that were her own eyes, looking down now, not in grief, but in something that Nell chose to believe was joy. "I think she knows," the old Duke said once on such an evening, gazing up at his wife's face with his daughter's arm through his. "I think, wherever she is, she knows it came right at last, that the child she never gave up on came home and was loved and is happy, and that her faith was true and ours was false, and that the lie is taken up out of the chapel floor and the truth is standing here beside me with her arm in mine. I could not believe her when she was living. I thought her grief had made her mad to keep insisting you were alive. She was not mad. She was only right and faithful and 20 years ahead of the rest of us. I hope she knows I know it now. I tell her so every evening. Perhaps that is foolish, talking to a picture, but I find I cannot regret it, for it eases something in me that was a long time aching. And I choose to think, that somewhere she hears and is glad and forgives me for the grave I made and the faith I lost. For she was always quicker to forgive than I deserved, your mother, and quicker to hope than any of us, and she was right about the only thing that ever truly mattered, which was you. And Nell had held her father's arm and looked up at her mother's face that was her own face and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, for the three of them were together, in the only way they ever could be, in that bright room where the morning had been. And it was enough. It was, after everything, more than enough. So bank your fire now, and turn your lamp low, and let the dark draw gentle and close. A laundress carried a basket down a strange corridor, and found her own face on a duchess's wall, and a broken father gazing at her like a man seeing the dead return, and a wicked man's 23 years of buried truth rose up to the light at last, as buried truth will always rise, and the lost child came home, and was known, and was loved, not for the fortune that was restored to her, nor even for the noble blood that was proved in her, but for the worth that had been hers all along, in the cottage and the great house alike, a worth no name could give and no poverty could take. Somewhere tonight, by some fire I shall never see, you have followed a stolen child home across 23 years and seen the truth rise and stayed until the lost was found. And I am glad of it, more glad than I can say, and I should dearly love to know where in the world you have been listening from. Remember that you too, whoever the world tells you that you are, carry your worth in your own soul, where no one can touch it. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit.